What's up, everybody? Parker's Plays here, and today we're doing a tier list. Today's tier list: video game controllers. Let's go. So to start, we've got the Nintendo Joy-Cons. I think those are pretty solid controllers. It's pretty cool how you can detach them from the console and you can use them however you want. And a lot of times they'll have motion controllers, like specifically what I'm thinking of is like Mario Odyssey. That's like the first one that comes to my mind, where you can throw Cappy and everything, which I think that's a really cool innovation. One thing that about the Joy-Cons that kind of brings it down is its Joy-Con drift. I know that's a big problem with a lot of people, and Nintendo's kind of had their only thing. They've had some kind of debacles with that, so I'm gonna put it in the B tier. Next up, Xbox 360 controller. Now this is the classic controller in my opinion. I think it's the classic. Got the 4 buttons, got 2 joysticks, D-pad, and the shoulder buttons. It's perfect. I think it's a perfect controller, and you can't really go much better than that. Now, the next is the Xbox original controller, which I never had an Xbox, but it looks very big. I feel like that thing looks like massive compared to like this 360 controller. So I'll probably give it a B tier just because it's big. B for big. Now, Super Nintendo. So the Super Nintendo, it added a couple extra buttons. It added the X and Y and then the shoulder buttons. So I think it's really cool that Nintendo was innovating on their controller design and giving them more functions so that way their games can have more inputs and do more things with that, more options for things. So I think this is definitely an A tier. Next up, PS4, the DualShock 4. I never had a PS4. I've owned a PS2, PS3, and but this is I think this is definitely a step up from the DualShock 3. Mostly because of the shoulder buttons. The shoulder buttons on the DualShock 3 were a bit rough, which I'll get to that in a minute. So this is another controller that has a little bit of innovation to it. It has a little touch bar sensor in the middle. I'm not exactly sure what functionalities it has in some games, but it's definitely got some kind of use, because otherwise they wouldn't have it. So I'll probably, you know what, this is another solid controller. I'll put it in an A tier. So now when it comes to these Sega controllers, I personally don't think the Sega controllers are very solid. They feel like just open plastic. The D-pads still feel really loose, and the buttons also, I feel like you can push them down. There's not really any kind of satisfying click when you push the buttons. So I think both of these are going to have to go in the C tier. Now the Wii U gamepad specifically. The gamepad was another innovation that Nintendo did, which is the precursor to the Switch itself. And I think the Wii U gamepad is actually really cool. It allowed you to play the games without even needing your TV, which really influenced what the Switch can do now. But the only problem is that people thought that the gamepad was a controller that you buy. So, whenever it came out, it was a whole thing about, people just wanted to buy the gamepad because that's all they thought they needed. But it's a whole new system for almost the same thing that the Wii is. So, you know what? I think the gamepad on its own as a controller, not a system, I think it's definitely an A tier. It's got the cool, it just does really well what it was designed to do, to be able to play the games on the go, kind of mixing their handheld consoles with their home consoles. I think that was a really smart push into what the Switch is today. All right, so the DualShock 1, I believe that's the DualShock 1. This is the PlayStation 1's second controller, because the original controller is right here without the joysticks. But I think it's the precursor to my favorite controller, which, well, I think my Xbox 360 is still my favorite, but the first PlayStation 1 controller, I think it's a solid B tier. Put it above Joy-Cons. There we go. Now the Switch Pro controller, I am a big fan of the Switch Pro controller. That's pretty much the only controller I use when I play on my Switch. I'll definitely give it an S tier. I'm just so used to it. The button layout is pretty solid. The shoulder buttons have a pretty satisfying push. I think it's pretty solid. Now, this controller is bunk. I think it's a C tier. solely because it doesn't have joysticks. I think joysticks make controllers just infinitely better. Obviously, it's a little different with the Super Nintendo because the games don't really require it. But when it comes to playing games on the PlayStation and beyond, they kind of need joysticks, and it's kind of hard to go without them. Alright, next up, DualShock 2. Now, this is another S tier controller for me. The PlayStation 2 was one of the first game consoles I ever owned, and I have a lot of fond memories with those, with that controller. Definitely had some good mornings playing on Saturday, on the weekends, getting everything going with my Sean Palmer's pro snowboarding games and playing Star Wars Battlefront, those kind of games. Had a lot of good memories. A really satisfying controller. Now the GameCube. Now the GameCube controller is another good showcase of controller innovation. It's got only 2 shoulder buttons still. Well, I guess 3 if you count the Z button. But the front-facing buttons, they have different shapes, different colors, different sizes. I think they really they wanted to go a little bit more towards the traditional look of a controller, but also adding some kind of different flair to it. I personally really like the GameCube controller. I definitely think it's a really solid A tier. Now, the NES controller, the controller that pretty much started it all, aside from Atari, which was just like the joystick with the one button and everything, but the NES controller, really, really good controller to like for the console itself. Being a primitive console, it only had a couple of buttons that it needed anyway. So it's not like today's where you need, all sorts of buttons to do different functions. So for what it's worth, I think the NES controller, probably low A tier. Now, the N64 controller, I got a bone to pick with this one. For one, why does it need 3 parts for your hands to hold? I get because some games require you to hold them in different ways, but I think that's so bizarre. Like, people aren't born with 3 hands, and you're not going to bring a friend over and say, hey, I'm going to use one hand of yours while we play together. No, that seems so ridiculous. So I think that's one weird little thing about that controller. Now the next thing, the joystick on that one is known for being just absolutely terrible. Like, whenever you're trying to make small adjustments, like if you're trying to rotate just a little bit or move your character just a little bit, it's impossible because the joysticks wore down so much that, when you do just a little input, it doesn't recognize the input until it's way too late, pretty much. And for those couple of reasons, I think this is definitely I'll give it a high C tier because there's some interesting functionality for it, but can't give it too much. Alright, Dreamcast. So I've never owned a Dreamcast. I think I've only ever known one person in the world who's ever owned one, but it looks kind of weird. I don't know, I'm not exactly sure what this little screen thing is at the front, and also the fact that the cable comes from the bottom. That seems kind of bizarre to me. There's also only one joystick and then the buttons, so I'm not exactly sure how some things would work with camera controls, so that'd be kind of interesting to see. But for just like looking at it face value, and I'll probably give it a low B tier. Now the Wii remotes. The Wii remote is probably one of the most innovative controllers I think that have ever been released. It's got the Wii remote itself in its own is a really interesting because it uses the motion controls and everything, and then you can also use it sideways for some of the virtual console games, and then you add the nunchuck and it's got a whole different element to it. Like, I know some people that played Smash Bros. Brawl with specifically the Wii remote and nunchuck, so it's definitely a really innovative, I keep saying innovative, it's the innovative controller I think out of everything on this list. I have to give it a good A tier. Probably, you know what, I'll give it right above the GameCube controller. Now the DualShock 3. The DualShock 3 I think was not as good as the DualShock 2. And that's mainly because of the shoulder buttons. The L2 and R2 buttons, if you place the controller down on a surface, basically it starts going off on the buttons because they like curl in rather than push as a button. Like they curl in almost like this rather than, you know, a click. So I think that was a really big flaw in the design of that controller. I'll have to give that I'll give that a mid C tier. You know what? Let's put it there. Now this looks just like another Xbox controller. I'm not exactly sure what console. Kind of looks like it's for the 360. So I'm not exactly sure what makes it so different from that one. So if it's an Xbox 360 controller, I'll put it up in the S tier as well. It might just be a wired Xbox 360 controller. It's what it is. Unless, yeah, that might actually be an Xbox original, but just wired. So I'll leave it there. That's fine. And last up, Xbox One controller. So Xbox One controller, I think the shoulder buttons, like the right button and the left button, those are a little funky to me personally. I think everything else is totally fine. It's got the right feel. The joysticks feel good. The D-pad feels good. The D-pad is definitely improved upon from the 360 controller. So I think just based on the fact that it's a solid controller, I'll probably put it in the A tier. All right. And there you have it. That's my list of all the controllers that were there. So let me know if you agree. Leave a like on the video. Comment whether you think I should have put the other controllers in a different spot. And subscribe for more content. Later.